Stuart Little. Chapter 8. Margalo. Because he was so small, Stuart was often hard to find around the house. His father and his mother and his brother George seldom could locate him by looking for him. Usually they had to call him, and the house often echoed with cries of, "Stuart! Stuart!" You would come into a room, and he might be curled up in a chair, but you wouldn't see him. Mr. Little was in a constant fear of losing him and never finding him again. He even made him a tiny red cap such as hunters wear, so that he would be easier to see. One day when he was 7 years old, Stuart was in the kitchen watching his mother make tapioca pudding. He was feeling hungry, and when Mrs. Little opened the door of the electric refrigerator to get something, Stuart slipped inside to see if he could find a piece of cheese. He supposed, of course, his mother had seen him, and when the door swung shut, he realized he was locked in. It surprised him greatly. "Help!" he called. "It's dark in here. It's cold in this refrigerator. Help! Let me out. I'm getting colder by the minute." But his voice was not strong enough to penetrate the thick wall. In the darkness, he stumbled and fell into a saucer of prunes. The juice was cold. Stuart shivered, and his teeth chattered together. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mrs. Little again opened the door and found him standing on a butter plate, beating his arms together to try and keep warm, and blowing on his hands and hopping up and down. There's the picture. "Mercy!" she cried. "Stuart, my poor little boy. How about a nip of brandy?" said Stuart. "I'm chilled to the bone." But his mother made him some hot broth instead, and put him to bed in his cigarette box, with the doll's hot water bottle against his feet. Even so, Stuart caught a bad cold, and this turned into bronchitis, and Stuart had to stay in bed for almost 2 weeks. During his illness, the other members of the family were extremely kind to Stuart. Mrs. Little played tic-tac-toe with him. George made him a soap bubble pipe and a bow and arrow. Mr. Little made him a pair of ice skates out of 2 paper clips. One cold afternoon, Mrs. Little was shaking her dust cloth out of the window when she noticed a small bird lying on the window sill, apparently dead. She brought it in and put it near the radiator, and in a short while it fluttered its wings and opened its eyes. It was a pretty little hen bird, brown with a streak of yellow on her breast. The Littles didn't agree on what kind of bird she was. "She's a wall-eyed vireo," said George scientifically. "I think she's more of a young wren," said Mr. Little. Anyways, they fixed a place for her in the living room and fed her and gave her a cup of water. Soon she felt much better and went hopping around the house, examining everything with the greatest care and interest. Presently, she hopped upstairs and into Stuart's room, where he was lying in bed. "Hello," said Stuart. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" "My name is Margalo," said the bird softly, in a musical voice. "I come from fields once tall with wheat, from pastures deep in ferns and thistles. I come from vales of meadows sweet, and I love to whistle." Stuart sat bolt upright in bed. "Say that again," he said. "I can't," replied Margalo. "I have a sore throat." "So have I," said Stuart. "I've got bronchitis." "You better not get too near me. You might catch it." "I'll stay right here by the door," said Margalo. "You can use some of my gargle if you want to," said Stuart, "and here are some nose drops, and I have plenty of Kleenex." "Thank you very much. You are very kind," replied the bird. "Did they take your temperature?" asked Stuart, who was beginning to be genuinely concerned about his new friend's health. "No," said Margalo, "but I don't think it would be necessary." "Well, we better make sure," said Stuart, "because I would hate to have anything happen to you. Here," and he tossed her the thermometer. Margalo put it under her tongue, and she and Stuart sat very still for 3 minutes. Then she took it out and looked at it, turning it slowly and carefully. "Normal," she announced. Stuart felt his heart leap for gladness. It seemed to him that he had never seen any creature so beautiful as this tiny bird, and he already loved her. "I hope," he remarked, "that my parents have fixed you up with a decent place to sleep." "Oh, yes," Margalo replied. "I'm going to sleep in the Boston fern on the bookshelf in the living room. It's a nice place for a city location. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think I shall go to bed. I see it's getting dark outside. I always go to bed at sundown. Good night, sir." "Please don't call me sir," cried Stuart. "Call me Stuart." "Very well," said the bird. "Good night, Stuart," and she hopped off with light bouncing steps. "Good night, Margalo," called Stuart. "See you in the morning." Stuart settled down under the bedclothes again. "There's a mighty fine bird," he whispered, and sighed a tender sigh. When Mrs. Little came in later to tuck Stuart in for the night and hear his prayers, Stuart asked her if she thought the bird would be quite safe sleeping down in the living room. "Quite safe, my dear," replied Mrs. Little. "What about the cat, Snowbell?" asked Stuart sternly. "Snowbell won't touch the bird," his mother said. "You go to sleep and forget all about it." Mrs. Little opened the window and turned out the light. Stuart closed his eyes and lay there in the dark, but he couldn't seem to fall asleep. He tossed and turned, and the bedclothes got all rumpled up. He kept thinking about the bird downstairs asleep in the fern. He kept thinking about Snowbell and about the way Snowbell's eyes gleamed. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he switched on the light. "There's just something in me that doesn't trust a cat," he muttered. "I can't sleep knowing that Margalo is in danger." Pushing the covers back, Stuart climbed out of the bed. He put on his wrapping and slippers. Taking his bow and arrow and his flashlight, he tiptoed out into the hall. Everyone had gone to bed and the house was dark. Stuart found his way to the stairs and descended slowly and cautiously into the living room, making no noise. His throat hurt him, and he felt a little bit dizzy. "Sick as I am," he said to himself, "this has got to be done." Being careful not to make a sound, he stole across to the lamp by the bookshelf, shining up the cord, and climbing out onto the bookshelf. Here was a faint ray of light from the street lamp outside, and Stuart could dimly see Margalo asleep in the fern, her head tucked under her wing. "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast," he whispered, repeating a speech he had heard in the movies. When he hid behind a candlestick and waited, listening and watching. For half an hour he saw nothing, heard nothing but the faint ruffles of Margalo's wings when she stirred in dream. The clock struck 10, loudly, and before the sound of the last stroke had died away, Stuart saw two gleaming yellow eyes peering out from behind the sofa. "So," thought Stuart, "I guess there's going to be something done after all." He reached for his bow and arrow. The cat came nearer. Stuart was frightened, but he was a brave mouse, even though he had a sore throat. He placed the arrow against the cord of the bow and waited. Snowbell crept softly towards the bookshelf and climbed noiselessly up into the chair within easy reach of the Boston fern where Margalo was asleep. When he crouched, ready to spring, his tail waved back and forth. His eyes gleamed bright. Stuart decided the time had come. He stepped out from behind the candlestick, knelt down, bent his bow, and took careful aim at Snowbell's left ear, which was nearest to him. "This is the finest thing I have ever done," thought Stuart, and he shot the arrow straight into the cat's ear. Snowbell squealed with pain and jumped down and ran off towards the kitchen. "A direct hit," said Stuart. "Thank heavens! Well, there's a good night's work well done." And he threw a kiss towards Margalo's sleeping form. It was a tired little mouse that crawled into bed a few minutes later, tired but ready for sleep at last. Chapter 9. A Narrow Escape. Margalo liked it so well at the Little's house, she decided to stay for a while instead of returning to the open country. She and Stuart became fast friends, and as the days passed, it seemed to Stuart that she grew more and more beautiful. He hoped she would never go away from him. One day, when Stuart had recovered from bronchitis, he took his new skates and put on his new ski pants and went out to look for an ice pond. He didn't get far. The minute he stepped out into the street, he saw an Irish Terrier, so he had to shinny up an iron gate and jump into a garbage can, where he hid in a grove of celery. While he was there, waiting for the dog to go away, a garbage truck from the Department of Sanitation drove up to the curb, and two men picked up the can. Stuart felt himself being hoisted high in the air. He peered over the side and saw that in another instant he and everything in the can would be dumped into the big trunk. "If I jump now, I'll kill myself," thought Stuart. So he ducked back into the can and waited. The men threw the can with a loud bump into the truck, where another man grabbed it, turned it upside down, shook everything out. Stuart landed on his head, buried 2 feet deep in slippery garbage. All around him was garbage, smelling strong. Under him, over him, on all four sides of him, garbage. Just as enormous world of garbage and trash and smell. It was a messy spot to be in. He had eggs on his trousers, butter on his cap, gravy on his shirt, orange pulp in his ear, and banana peel wrapped around his waist. Still hanging on to his skates, Stuart tried to make his way up to the surface of the garbage, but the footing was bad. He climbed a pile of coffee grounds, but near the top the grounds gave way under him and he slid down, landing in a pool of leftover rice pudding. I bet I'm going to be sick to my stomach before I get out of this, said Stuart. He was anxious to work his way up to the top of the pile because he was afraid of being squashed by the next can load of garbage. When at last he did succeed in getting to the surface, tired and smelly, he observed that the truck was not making any more collections, but was rumbling rapidly along. Stuart glanced up at the sun. We're going east, he said to himself. I wonder what that means. There was no way for him to get out of the truck. The sides were too high. He just had to wait. When the truck arrived at the East River, which borders New York City on the east and which is a rather dirty but useful river, the driver drove out onto the pier, backing up to the garbage scow and dumping his load. Stuart went crashing and slithering along with everything else and hit his head so hard he fainted and lay quite still, as though dead. He laid that way for almost an hour, and when he recovered his senses, he looked about him and saw nothing but water. The scow was being towed out to sea. Well, thought Stuart, this is about the worst thing that could happen to anyone. I guess this will be my last ride in this world. For he knew that the garbage would be towed 20 miles out and dumped into the Atlantic Ocean. I guess there's nothing I can do about it, he thought hopelessly. I just have to sit here bravely and die like a man. But I wish I didn't have to die with egg on my pants, and butter on my cap, and gravy on my shirt, and orange pulp in my ear, and a banana peel wrapped around my middle. The thought of death made Stuart sad, and he began to think of his home, and of his father and mother and brother, and of Margalo and Snowbell, and of how he loved them, all but Snowbell, and of what a pleasant place his home was, especially in the early morning with the light just coming in through the curtains and the household stirring and waking. The tears came into his eyes when he realized that he would never see them again. He was still sobbing when a small voice behind him whispered, he looked around through his tears, and there, sitting on a Brussels sprout, was Margalo. Margalo! Cried Stuart. How did you get here? Well, said the bird, I was looking out the window this morning when you left home, and I happened to see you get dumped into the garbage truck, so I flew out of the window and followed the truck, thinking you might need help. I've never been so glad to see anyone in all my life, said Stuart. But how are you going to help me? I think that if you'll hang on to my feet, said Margalo, I can fly ashore with you. It's worth trying anyway. How much do you weigh? 3 ounces and a half, said Stuart. With your clothes on? Asked Margalo. Certainly, replied Stuart modestly. Then I believe I can carry you all right. Suppose I get dizzy, said Stuart. Don't look down, replied Margalo. Then you won't get dizzy. Suppose I get sick to my stomach. You'll just have to be sick, the bird replied. Anything is better than death. Yeah, that's true, Stuart agreed. Hang on then, we might as well get started. Stuart tucked his skates into his shirt, stepped gingerly onto the tuft of lettuce, and took a firm grip on Margalo's ankles. All ready, he cried. With a flutter of wings, Margalo rose into the sky, carrying Stuart along, and together they flew out over the ocean and headed towards home.